What if I told you that bourbon prices could skyrocket not because of inflation or distilleries being greedy, but because of politics? And what if I told you those same politics could actually lead to more older aged bourbon on shelves in the future? Today, we're breaking down the complex world of whiskey tariffs and what they could mean for your bourbon collection. Welcome back to World of Whiskey, the channel where we dive deep into bourbon history, news, and culture. If you love whiskey content like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoyed today's breakdown, drop a like and click the subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. Let's start with a little history. Back in 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. In response, the European Union retaliated with their own tariffs, and bourbon was right in the crosshairs. Suddenly, American whiskey exports to Europe were slapped with a 25% tariff. The impact was immediate, and brutal exports dropped by more than 35% almost overnight. Distilleries who had been banking on the European market suddenly had cases of whiskey they couldn't move, and international growth plans stalled. This wasn't the first time bourbon has been used as a political pawn. Whiskey, especially Kentucky bourbon, is deeply tied to American identity. Politicians know that targeting bourbon makes headlines and puts pressure on U.S. lawmakers, especially since Kentucky often has senators in powerful positions. In other words, bourbon becomes the perfect symbolic target in a trade war. So why does bourbon always get caught in the middle? It's simple. It represents America in the same way Scotch represents Scotland or cognac represents France. By targeting bourbon, countries can send a message to the U.S. government while hitting an industry that has both cultural weight and economic importance. That's why whenever trade disputes flare up, bourbon is usually one of the first products to get slapped with tariffs. Now, what happens when tariffs go into effect? For starters, European consumers suddenly face much higher prices for bottles that were already considered premium. That means demand drops. Importers and distributors don't want to take the risk, so they stock less bourbon, and distilleries here in Kentucky lose a huge chunk of their revenue stream. Remember, Europe is bourbon's single biggest export market, so these tariffs hit hard. Even smaller craft distilleries trying to expand globally took a hit. Many of them had to halt international growth because those tariffs made it financially impossible to compete. The effects go way beyond distilleries themselves. Think about the entire ecosystem: the farmers growing corn, rye, and wheat, the coopers making barrels, the trucking companies transporting product. Even Kentucky tourism, which is heavily tied to bourbon, takes a hit. When exports decline, jobs are affected across the board. But here's something interesting, and it's a point I don't hear talked about enough. When bourbon can't move overseas, that whiskey has to go somewhere. Often, that means it stays in warehouses here in the U.S., aging longer than originally planned. That could result in us seeing more older aged products hit the market. Think about it. Distilleries suddenly have stock that wasn't exported. If it sits for a few extra years, it could eventually be bottled as a 12, 15, or even older expression. So that's one silver lining of tariffs: more aged whiskey in the pipeline. Of course, this comes with short-term pain for distilleries because cash flow slows down. But for bourbon enthusiasts, it could mean access to more mature releases in the future. So what does this mean for American drinkers right now? First, prices could rise even here at home because distilleries may try to make up for lost export revenue by raising domestic prices. Second, some bottles that would normally head to Europe could stay here. That might mean more chances for us to find limited releases on shelves, although availability would still depend on distribution choices. But again, don't get your hopes up for endless older stock hitting shelves. Distilleries plan years in advance, and while tariffs could shake things up, there's no guarantee those barrels will be bottled for consumers rather than sold in other ways. Now let's talk about where we stand today. At the time of recording this video, no new tariffs on American whiskey have actually gone into effect. The threats are there, but so far they've been used mainly as leverage in broader trade negotiations. In other words, bourbon is once again being dangled as a bargaining chip in disputes that have very little to do with whiskey itself. This is why it's important to pay attention to the news, because while no one wants to see tariffs happen, the bourbon industry has to prepare for them every time these negotiations flare up. Here's the big picture. Bourbon is in a growth phase worldwide. Exports have been steadily increasing, and the category is gaining ground against Scotch, Irish, and Japanese whiskey. But tariffs threaten that progress. If Europe sees bourbon as too expensive, drinkers may turn to Scotch or Irish whiskey instead. And once shelf space and consumer habits shift, it's tough to win that ground back. So here's my take. I don't believe these tariffs are about to crush bourbon. I think they're more of a political negotiation tactic than a long-term strategy. That said, the risks are real, and we saw the damage tariffs did just a few years ago. If they were reinstated, we'd see short-term pain in the industry, higher prices here at home, and slower international growth. But there is that potential silver lining, more older whiskey being available in the future. To me, that makes this situation complicated but also fascinating. So what do you think? If tariffs went into effect, would you be willing to pay a little more in the short term if it meant more older age bourbon in the long run? Or do you think tariffs could do real long-term damage to the industry? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, please like the video, subscribe to World of Whiskey, and share this with another bourbon enthusiast who would appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and remember, every pour has a story.